G'day, H.M. Hart here. Borderline personality. Whether you consider it a serious mental illness, or whether you can see it through the humanistic lens of it is a response to adverse childhood experience, whether you have BPD or whether you're somebody who has a relative, a friend, a family member, or a significant other, or a partner or an ex-partner who has BPD. Well, what's really important to know about that right now, if you don't already, many people might know already. Well, it's really important to remember that splitting happens in BPD for more reasons, right? It is driven by more than black and white thinking. And black and white thinking in BPD is a little bit different from the black and white thinking that exists in human beings, if they aren't more careful to take the time to really have a balance, take the time and have the ability to have a balance of emotional intelligence and intellectual intelligence. Because that's the healthiest balance from which people can not only know what they feel, identify what they feel, so that will help you in how you're going to respond or not respond to something, to not just react to something. And the other thing about this is that you want to think about people, like if you're somebody with BPD, or if you on the other side of someone in any relationship type, it's not just people with BPD that think in black and white ways. So, but people with BPD, until less significant treatment, will definitely not only think in black and white ways, which is not all what the splitting is, although that's part of that, but they can think in black and white ways without being in a idealization or devaluation split. It's not always one thing or the other. So why is this important? Well, because it gets into the reality that when people have BPD, and what that really means, by the way, again, it's a response to adverse childhood experience. So then this question comes up for a lot of people. Isn't the fact that somebody has borderline personality their fault? Like, come on, it has to be their fault, because everything they do, excuse me, how they might behave, because they might behave really black and white, really, really hot and cold, really like all one way or all the other, and it's very changeable, and it gets very confusing for people, and it's also very wounding for people. But is it the person's fault that they have BPD? Because a lot of people online, a lot of clients are asking me that I'm working with, it's like, well, but he or she just did or said this or did that, and I don't know why that happened, and the next thing you know, like, they were really mad and upset, and then I got reacted, I reacted and I felt hurt, or people don't always know what they feel, but they react back, and then maybe there's an argument, conflict, or the opposite, which can be like conflict avoidance on both parties' parts, and then nobody really knows what's going on, you're really confused. So all this is their fault, right? Like everything a person with BPD does that hurts you, confuses you, or that might really be the reason why a relationship ends, or they ghost you, or what have you. It's all the person with BPD's fault, right? Well, it's an interesting question and dilemma because, first of all, I would say, from my wealth of experience, not only somebody who had BPD and recovered, but had people with BPD and narcissists in my family of origin, and comorbidity of BPD and PD mother, and, work with clients for 30 years. But with all that said, no, it's actually nobody's fault that they have BPD. So that's the first and foremost thing to understand. Not their fault that if they have BPD. But here's the rub part for people with BPD. It's really hard to accept for many, which is once they become an adult, they're now responsible for getting the kind of help to change, to heal, to grow, to heal the woundedness of why they are having all the difficulties that are described within the traits and seen often by people in the behavior, the unhealthy relational style of people with BPD that makes that the impossibility of the way they relate to people that makes so many relationships, friendships, mother-daughter, sibling relationships fall apart, not be able to be sustained through that kind of chaos and drama and adverse experience that people with BPD can bring to relating. And that happens because they have an arrested emotional self by the age of 2, and they lose themselves, lack of stable sense of identity, but really they don't know themselves well. They're very changeable. And so in that regard, too, they're not love bombing you, they're idealizing and mirroring you. And there is a difference, because narcissists love bomb and people with BPD aren't love bombing. And the other thing is, so it's really important to realize that, yes, if you have BPD, it's not your fault that you have it. But once you become an adult, you need to get treatment and therapy, and it's a long-term kind of deal to really do the deepest work. You can really find recovery and healing, and you can learn how to relate to people differently when you find yourself and you know how to relate to yourself. So in the meantime, with so many people with BPD out there who are not getting any help, any treatment, any therapy, or even the ones midway along getting it, but still having rather a lot of cognitive distorted thoughts around what that looks like and what that even means for themselves and or in relationship to someone else. Well, it's really important to realize that people with BPD it's a very difficult thing for people with BPD. It's difficult for those who have someone in their life with BPD in any relationship type. People with BPD are responsible for their behavior, for what they do or don't do, how they treat you, and if they're wounding to you and very hurtful. But as much as they're responsible for it, they're often very much not conscious of what they're doing. But they're still responsible. So then it's like, so is what happens from somebody with BPD in your life that they're actually doing, saying, acting out or acting in, is that their, quote, fault, unquote? Well, yes and no. Again, not really, quote, fault, unquote, but responsibility, absolutely. And so it's really important for people to think about this, too, because along with this narrative, sort of like the idea of black and white thinking, it's not the only thing that drives splitting. And the other part of that would be, so yes, people with BPD are responsible as adults for their behavior, for the way they relate to people, for that relational impossibility that they don't understand. But you can't get them to understand what they don't understand and what they're defended against. And so then it leaves you at a choice point. And then people, I know, like, clients have been speaking to me recently about choices, right? Whether that's a person with BPD or a person with codependency, or somebody, who's got someone with BPD in any relationship type in their life, like family member, parent, adult, child. It's really difficult to put it in simplistic terms, like everything is one way, because it becomes a dynamic. And the other aspect of that, too, is that people can have black and white thinking themselves, right? If you're experiencing somebody with BPD and they're very changeable, they don't know who they are, and it's very much unstable relating, and you're still, in significant other relationships, people are still believing or wanting to believe that this person is who you thought that you fell in love with. But here's the other part of this. It's really important to remember. This is just kind of like a quick summary of a few points that I think might be helpful to people to think about. People with BPD, when they idealize you and mirror you, and their codependency is in the forefront, where they are really trying to people please you, please you. They want you to like them, and they mean, to be who they're trying to be in that moment, but they're also seeking to gain identity through you, which is a subconscious thing they're not aware of. They're not actually loving you. They're not actually seeing you. So it's not actually accurate to say that they really do love you until they split to devaluation, and then they don't love you anymore, because they never really love or attach in the first place. So, and I've talked about this in a lot of videos too, but I wanted to touch on it again, because it's important to know that, first of all, people with BPD are not, quote, love bombing, unquote. Secondly, because narcissists do that. It has nothing to do, I call it bait bombing. It has nothing to do with love, or healthy love, or even anything to do with love. You know, even like, quote, not healthy love, unquote, because it's not love. So do they really love you in this idealization? Check out my video. I'll make a card happen here, right? Check out my video, Inside BPD Idealization. Because no, they don't see you any more in idealization than they do in devaluation. So it's not a person's fault that they have BPD, because this happens in childhood, and children aren't responsible for what happens to them in childhood. Their parents are. Largely, in 75 to 80% of the case. Well, I mean, in general, but with people that have BPD. But so the other thing is, but they are responsible once they become adults. So we need to quantify that by saying adult age, right? For their behavior and their reactions and betrayals and things that they often bring to people's lives in all different relationship types, all types of relationships. Friendships, significant other, family, sibling, parent, adult, child. And so with all of that said, it's really important to remember too that as much as they need to take responsibility when they reach adulthood, many people with BPD sadly aren't ever going to get there at all in their lives. Many more people are going to learn and get some treatment and get to a certain extent through that treatment, or partially through it, or halfway down the road, which is going to mean they still have a lot of relational difficulty, but they might improve some things. But to get to personal responsibility for somebody with BPD takes really in-depth therapy that they are committed to and choosing for themselves and want like a dog with a bone. So what I'm trying to say here is that when they reach the adult age, or when they're adults, they're responsible for their behavior, the way they relate, the way they hurt others, etc. Yes. However, on an emotional level, they're not fully adult. So I'm not trying to take away their responsibility. They still need to learn how to take personal responsibility. But you have to remember, if you have somebody with BPD in your life today, or you have an ex, or you've been ghosted, or you broke up with somebody, or you've been ghosted, or you're getting a silent treatment, or whatever the case, from somebody with BPD in a different relationship type in your life, that they're not 2 years old necessarily at all, right? But they're still sort of like adolescent young, emotionally speaking, and lacking emotional intelligence. And unless they develop a self, find themselves to find the lost self, because the self gets lost to this largely core wound of abandonment. And there's more to it than that, and I'll be talking about more of that too. But they lose the self. So it's not just unstable identity, it's like they don't know who they are. And so I'm not making any apologies for anybody with BPD. I'm just saying that when they become adults, yes, they need to learn to get in. They need to get into treatment therapy to learn how to take personal responsibility, but they need to find the lost self to be able to do that. And so, that's rather complicated for people with BPD to do, and it's not something that can happen rather quickly. And so also realize that while people with BPD have more severe black and white thinking with a lot of cognitive distortions, that people who don't have BPD, some people with codependency, other people that might be in a family member of somebody with BPD or a different relationship type, that doesn't always indicate codependency, often does, but whatever the case, everybody, unless you're really conscious and paying attention to how you think, everybody can think in rather black and white ways at times. It's a thought distortion. It's a way of being just not really aware of what one is thinking, or how one is reacting to something, how you're feeling and thinking, what is your entire response to anything or anyone. So I think it's really important to realize that it's not people's fault that they have BPD. Yes, they need to take responsibility as adults, but before they can do that, they need to get significant, years-long treatment before they can take personal responsibility. And not only that, but find the lost self and know that self, because it's how they relate to self or lack of self, no self. That's how they're going to relate to other. And nothing about that can be changed without deep. So DBT skills is a great place to start, not a recovery modality. But more therapy than that, and deep therapy, and unfortunately it takes years for people to keep going down those layers and layers and levels to find self, to know self, and what the whole process of recovery from BPD actually entails. So this kind of change is not going to be made fast enough to save a relationship, fast enough to change anything for you if you're in any relationship type. So it's really difficult, but people with BPD are not necessarily 2 years old, no, but they're not emotionally, they don't have the emotional intelligence that we would expect healthier adults to have, but neither do codependents exactly, always. So just realize and remember that black and white thinking is not just something in BPD, but it is more intense and more prevalent, not the only driver to splitting. People with BPD do not love bomb, and they're idealizing and mirroring you out of their codependency at that point. And then people with codependency have reasons why they don't have boundaries against that, and boundaries against other things that happen in the getting to know the person with BPD part of it, of significant other relationships. So really important to know that. And then people talk about choices. Well, people with BPD are very not aware of choices. And yes, they're making choices all the time, but they're often predicated on automatic defensive protective choices that are entrenched and ingrained, and they are rather automatic. So they're not aware of the thoughts or feelings behind the actions that happen so quickly. So within this then, for people with codependency, for people with BPD, there's black and white thinking on both sides. There's cognitive dissonance, cognitive bias, cognitive misperception, cognitive distortion. So not to the same levels or degrees, but this is what makes everything, besides how people with BPD, are going to relate to you because they don't know who they are. And I'm not being an apologist about that, or when they treat people poorly. But it's going to be that roller coaster dynamic because there's nothing stable. And the key thing I wanted to say in this video too, just to reiterate, is people with BPD do not love you and do not attach to you unless and until significant treatment, because they don't have a self from which, no self-reference from which to have other reference, no self from which to love self, to love you from, to trust you from. So anyway, I hope that might just be an interesting little, or helpful for some people, recap of a big part of the dilemma, and yet cognitive biases, cognitive distortion, stinking thinking, black and white thinking is not just a domain of people with BPD. It's in humanity too. So you really need to think more about where you're at with somebody, or if you're the ex, where you're at with somebody with BPD in your life, and how are you dealing with what you need to deal with, and are you still overreactionary, and what kind of cognitive dissonance, emotional dissonance, cognitive biases, etc., are driving you right now, emotionally and or behaviorally, reactionarily, one way or the other, whether you're, able to get to no contact or haven't been able to do that yet. So, hope that was helpful. I really think it matters, words like love bombing, that's what narcissists do, not people with BPD. And it really matters. And they also, it's not their fault they had BPD, but it's a responsibility now. But to say it's a responsibility now because they're an adult now by age does not speak to that they still don't know who they are if they're untreated or not significantly treated. So, and when you do get to no contact, if you need to, it's best to do that without making any promise that you're going to go back and, or they can call you in a year or whatever. Because a year of therapy for somebody with BPD, some people can make some changes that matter, but not enough to keep a relationship going. And what are you going to do for that year in your life? You got to take care of yourself. You got to focus on your own healing recovery journey and what that really means and how really you can do that in an effective manner. So I hope that was helpful. Take care.